was completely innocent, and that from the moment Jean entered Stockwell tube station, he was doomed to be shot dead without warning.
In the summer of 2005, London was paralyzed by fear. On July 7th, a series of coordinated suicide bombings had rocked the city's underground train and bus systems, leaving 52 people dead and hundreds wounded. The attacks were the deadliest on British soil in modern history, and in their aftermath, the government launched a massive counterterrorism operation known as Operation Kratos. Operation Kratos authorized police to use lethal force preemptively against any suspected suicide bomber without warning. A policy built for instant, irreversible action. The directive was simple. If there was any credible belief that a suspect posed an imminent threat, armed officers were instructed to neutralize them immediately. The stakes were unimaginably high, and the margin for error was razor thin. Just 2 weeks after the attacks, on July 21st, another wave of attempted bombings rocked London. Fortunately, these devices failed to fully detonate, but the failed attacks threw the entire city into a renewed state of panic. A desperate manhunt ensued as police scrambled to track down the perpetrators before they could strike again. In this charged atmosphere, 27-year-old Jean Charles de Menezes prepared for a normal day. He was a Brazilian immigrant living in South London, sharing an apartment with friends while working as an electrician to support his family back home. Jean Charles was known as cheerful, ambitious, and hardworking, completely disconnected from the terror plots that had gripped his new city. Unbeknownst to him, officers from Scotland Yard had mistakenly linked his apartment building to one of the suspected bombers. Surveillance teams were dispatched, but they arrived late, with incomplete intelligence. When Jean Charles exited his building that morning, officers wrongly assumed he was one of the suspects they were hunting. Despite his clear physical differences, Jean Charles was shorter, stockier, and had no resemblance to the suspect. A deadly chain reaction had already begun. Jean Charles boarded a bus heading towards Stockwell Underground Station. Surveillance officers followed, but failed to positively identify him. Communication between surveillance teams and the command center grew increasingly frantic. As Jean Charles approached the station, more tactical units were deployed, escalating the operation into a full-scale pursuit. Inside the train station, the pressure reached its peak. Officers feared that any hesitation might result in mass casualties. The command center authorized lethal force under Operation Kratos protocols. Jean Charles passed calmly through the ticket barriers, used his Oyster card as normal, and proceeded to the platform. Surveillance officers maintained visual contact, but failed to stop him before he boarded the train. Tactical firearms officers, now moments behind, burst onto the train seconds later. In a matter of moments, chaos unfolded. Jean Charles was restrained by undercover officers, pushed into his seat. Without warning, armed officers fired 7 shots into his head at close range. The operation had concluded, but not in triumph, in catastrophe. The public was initially told that police had neutralized a suicide bomber in the act of attempting another attack. But within hours, it became clear that something had gone horribly wrong. Jean Charles was entirely innocent. He carried no explosives. He had no connection to any terrorist networks. He was simply a young man trying to get to work. The media storm erupted almost instantly. Across London, outrage mounted as the facts unraveled. Early police claims that Jean Charles had jumped the barriers, fled from officers, and worn heavy clothing suggesting a bomb vest, collapsed under scrutiny. CCTV footage revealed he had acted entirely normally. He did not run. He wore a light denim jacket, in no way consistent with concealing explosives. The Metropolitan Police were forced onto the defensive. As public anger grew, senior officials insisted that their officers had acted in good faith, believing they were preventing another tragedy. But for Jean Charles's devastated family, those explanations offered little comfort.
The mistakes of the police are now clear. Action must be taken against the officers responsible.
The Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPCC, was tasked with investigating the shooting. What they uncovered was deeply disturbing. Communication failures plagued the operation at every level. Surveillance officers lost track of Jean Charles multiple times, yet command staff continued to escalate the operation rather than pausing to reassess. Perhaps most damning were revelations that police had altered logs after the fact, adjusting reports to make their decisions appear more justified. These attempts at damage control deepened public mistrust. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that systemic failures, not simply individual mistakes, had led to Jean Charles's death. Protesters flooded the streets of London demanding accountability. International news outlets framed the shooting as a tragic example of racial profiling and excessive use of force. Jean Charles's Brazilian heritage added a global dimension to the outrage, with protests spreading as far as Rio de Janeiro. The inquest into Jean Charles's death painted a chilling picture of institutional breakdown. Surveillance teams lacked clear leadership. Intelligence sharing between MI5, counterterrorism units, and local police was disjointed and chaotic. Officers were operating on assumptions rather than verified facts. And yet, no one was held personally responsible. The Crown Prosecution Service ultimately declined to press criminal charges against any officer involved. Instead, the Metropolitan Police Service as a whole was prosecuted for breaching health and safety laws. A symbolic charge that many viewed as a grossly inadequate response to a fatal shooting of an innocent man. For the de Menezes family, the legal outcome was devastating. Their son, brother, and nephew had been executed in broad daylight with no meaningful accountability. Still, they refused to remain silent. Jean Charles' relatives became outspoken advocates for police reform, speaking before the European Court of Human Rights and demanding systemic change.
It's everything finished now. It's a 10 years, the painful 10 years, I think finished now.
The Jean Charles de Menezes case exposed a terrifying truth: that even in democratic societies, institutions built to protect can become instruments of irreversible harm when fear overrides due process. It revealed how racial and cultural bias can subtly influence high-pressure decisions, and how errors compounded by loyalty and institutional self-protection can leave grieving families without justice. In the years since, police forces across the UK have re-evaluated counterterrorism protocols, surveillance procedures, and the authorization of lethal force. But for many, Jean Charles's name remains a haunting symbol, not just of one tragic mistake, but of a system that failed in its most basic duty: to preserve life. This is Vaulted Crimes, real stories, real consequences.